Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. This is a new year. And though it might be a challenge, there are things that we can be happy about. So it's good to see you. My name is James Williams. I'm a co-founder, former co-chair of OCCRC. This afternoon, I'm excited for this discussion, and I'll leave it to my friend, Professor Reg Hildebrand, to introduce our author and speaker. I want to say a few words about my friend Reg Hildebrand. And I mean, we know he's a scholar, we know he writes, and he does this. He's an excellent speaker. I don't know whether you get degrees in storytelling, but if you don't, he's a storyteller too. And I just said, I got to put this guy to work. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to my friend.
Part of why I enjoy and learn from my interactions with James Williams is the depth of his commitment to history and to public history. One of the best lectures I ever heard was by Harry Belafonte, when he was reflecting on the culture of our times in his own development in New York in the 50s. And he said the main problem with our culture now isn't that it's just part of a reflection of an old man. It's not that it was violent or sexist or racist, although it was all of those things. He said the main problem is it's so shallow. It doesn't allow people to think deeply about anything. In fact, it does just the opposite. It makes you think in a shallow way and make unfortunate decisions. So part of his mission has been to give us opportunities to think deeply about the history that we shaped us. So I'm proud to know you, James, and I respect what you're doing, and I'm glad to be one of the members of your team. My job now is to set the stage for Paul by telling you a little bit about the time period, the book, and its author. From the state's origin until the Civil War, Black people in North Carolina were enslaved, and regardless of age, sex, or family relationships, they were regarded as individual units of chattel property to be retained, bought, sold, transferred, or inherited like other property. That was presumed to be the natural order of things. By law, by custom and culture, powerful people of faith believed that it was all ordained by God. But then the war came, and the natural order of things began to shake. In 1861, the foundation had been laid for the new Caswell County Courthouse, and even as the ornate finishing touches of that imposing, beautiful building were being completed, the foundation and the structure of the slave-holding society it was meant to uphold were beginning to crumble and fall apart, or at least so it seemed for a while. The author has told me that in some ways, that building is a character in his book. Slavery ended with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, and in 1868, Black men were given the right to vote and to participate in shaping a new state constitution, and they became eligible to run for political office and hold positions in the government. which for the first time could be called government by and for the people, black and white. But the pushback was swift and violent. So for a brief window, from 1868 to 1870, dramatic political change seemed possible in the state. For some, it was wonderful and inspiring. For others, it was unnatural and tragic. All agreed that it was chaotic. Stepping boldly into that maelstrom was an improbable champion of biracial democracy called John W. Stevens, who held positions as a voting registrar for newly enfranchised citizens and was elected to serve in the state senate, but was known to his detractors as the convicted thief of 2 chickens. The story behind that conviction is interesting and absurd, Paul may tell it. Our author, Paul M. Green, wrote this about him. Stevens stepped into the breach like no other white man in Caswell County, like few men anywhere in the South, standing up to the Ku Klux Klan at the height of its power and prestige, and paying for it with his life. As much as any one incident, it was the murder of Stevens in May of 1870 in that beautiful Caswell County courthouse that caused Governor William Woods Holden to launch an effort to confront and crush the Klan that became known as the Kirk-Holden War and resulted in the governor's impeachment and removal from office. One of the unique contributions of this book is Green's critical legal assessment of the legislation that authorized Holden's efforts to confront the Klan. After the tumult and promise of this brief period, many years would pass before the battle to achieve a biracial democracy was renewed in this state and the whole South. Everyone in this room knows that history was med and the national news media paid much attention when Howard Lee was elected mayor of this city in 1969, 100 years later. The story could be the subject of a great novel or a riveting motion picture. But fortunately for us, it has been the subject of a remarkable and important history book written by Green called The Thief, the Senator, and the Knight of the Bleeding Heart, John Stevens and the Ku Klux Klan in Reconstruction, North Carolina. An assessment of the book appearing in the North Carolina Historical Review said this: Attorney Paul Green blends a thorough mining of available primary sources with a careful analysis of local, state, and national politics. Green carefully grounds Stevens within his local community and the relationships that shaped his character, political career, and his murder. He offers trenchant analysis of legal actions that defined Reconstruction in the state. And the reviewer adds that the book is written in, and I quote, an accessible and sometimes witty manner. In addition to the thief Stevens, the other main characters are the senator, who was the very distinguished, highly respected, and deeply committed white supremacist Bedford Brown, and the Knight of the Bleeding Heart, who was a violent Klansman named John Lee. There is an amazing story behind that name that I think you will hear about shortly. But in addition, readers of this book will encounter Albion Torgi, Black leaders like Farrell Glass and Samuel Allen, Presidents Andrew Johnson and Ulysses Grant, agents of the Freedmen's Bureau, local sheriffs, and Southern Methodist pastors. They all have roles in Greene's carefully crafted and painstakingly researched narrative. I've known, like James, I've known Paul a long time. I first got to know him because he provided the original impetus and much of the initial hard work for what has developed into the remarkable, inspiring North Carolina Freedom Park in Raleigh. Here is what he has written about himself and the origins of this book, and I quote, "In 2018, I retired from over 30 years practicing law, death penalty appeals, habeas corpus, felony criminal appeals, civil rights, and class actions. With my newfound free time, I decided to find out what I could about my own North Carolina ancestors. That research led me to the story of John Walter Stevens' murder in 1870, and the realization that after 150 years, professional historians had never thoroughly investigated the primary source materials surrounding this celebrated case. Paul is the grandson and the namesake of Paul Greene, the renowned Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and activist for social and racial justice. He is also a proud member of the Gentlemen's Book and Bottle Club, and I see at least one member of that group here this afternoon supporting Paul. Paul will now tell us about what he found on his historical journey to Caswell County and into the life of John Stevens. And after that, for just about 15 minutes, he and I will have a brief conversation about his book, and following that, there will be questions from and conversations with all of you. Paul?
Thank you, Reg, for that very much overly generous introduction. I'm not complaining. Thank you, James, for initiating this event and the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition for sponsoring it. And the librarians for what they've done, and for whoever is responsible for this fantastic audiovisual system, which I just can plug my computer in and show you some pictures, which I hope are not too distracting, because they're not the main thing. I tried to write this book very much in the spirit of the Coalition's commitment to remembrance, to recovering voices that have been neglected. And very often those voices were deliberately buried. We honor those victims of racial terror, not just as victims, but for having the courage to do whatever it was they did that pissed off the Ku Klux Klan. And for the most part, that was acted too free. But sometimes it was because they stood up to the Klan, they fought back. And the Klan didn't like that. John Stevens was one of those. But he's known today almost exclusively because of his murder. And the fact that, as Red was explaining, that his murder set off the sequence of events that resulted in Governor Holden being removed from office. So here's the marker that appears outside the Caswell County Courthouse. And you see, it tells you that he was murdered. It doesn't tell you what he did during his life or why he was killed or who killed him. I would like to see him remembered as a brave fighter against the Ku Klux Klan who tried to uphold the most basic law, which is that prohibiting violence against innocent people. That's what he was about. But I want to start the introduction to John Stevens kind of by a side door with another man who was just as brave as Stevens, named Sam Allen. He worked with Stevens. He was with Stevens very shortly before Stevens was killed. They were both under threat of murder by the Klan. The Klan was going after both of them. It got Stevens. Allen got away. But Allen has been completely forgotten. He was a freeborn black man. Stevens was white, by the way. Some people who hear about Stevens, they assume that he was black. He was not. So in 1867, Sam Allen started a school on his property there in Caswell County. So the local children who had recently been enslaved, or the children of enslaved, could learn to read. In 1868, he was a Union League leader who worked very hard and was responsible for getting out the black vote in Caswell County. So by 1870, Allen's school was self-supported. He had 30 tuition-paying students, and a young black man who boarded with the Allens was the teacher, and they were succeeding. There are Freedmen's Bureau records that show that these kids were learning. Like half of the kids in that school were already advanced readers. Well, the Ku Klux Klan couldn't stand to see black kids learning how to read. And one thing that's worth remembering is that a lot of the adult whites in that part of North Carolina at this time were completely illiterate, couldn't even sign their own names. So you see black kids learning to read, they couldn't handle it. So one day, 15 or 20 of them came to Allen's house and tried to drag him outside for a beating. And the first one who tried to force his way in Allen's house, I don't know where he got it, but he had a heavy cavalry saber. He ran that guy through and pitched him out into the yard. He probably killed him, but we don't know for sure. Then Allen escaped out the back of his house, and he got away. So now, we don't just have 15 or 20 Klansmen who want to give Sam Allen a beating. We've got like every Klansman in Caswell County who wants to lynch him. And a few nights later, about 200 of them come down the road to Allen's house. They surround it, they find he's not there. So what do you do if you're out in the country? No law enforcement, no soldiers, and every Ku Klux for miles around out to get you. Well, what Allen did, he spent the next 3 days traveling to Yanceyville, Graham, and Greensboro, looking for the one man that he thought might possibly be able to get protection for him at his school. And that man was John Stevens. So I tell you that story because I think it's important in its own way. Sam Allen should have a historical marker. Where he did this is the people in that community, I assume some of them still know about this. This story has never been written about. But there's a place called Allen's Chapel where all this happened. There was a school there once. So the story is worth remembering in its own right, but it also tells you a lot about how John Stevens was perceived by the black people of Caswell County. He was somebody that they could trust, somebody who might help them, somebody who might go out on a limb for them. But the histories were not written by the black people of Caswell County. They were written by white lost cause historians who were sympathetic to the Klan. And the foremost among those was Professor J.G. Hamilton at UNC. And there's a building named after him. For a long time, he was considered one of the foremost authorities on Reconstruction in North North Carolina. No longer, but for decades, his word was gold. He said Stevens was, quote, a man of bad reputation and evil political life. And he was, in the eyes of the white supremacists of 1870. Now, I called Stevens the thief in the title of my book because his enemies said he was a chicken thief. And they called him Chicken Stevens. And we've seen this ourselves recently. Crooked Hillary and Little Marco and Sleepy Joe. It's standard political slander. But somehow the historians picked that up and they kept that name alive for the last, 150 years. Well, when the Republicans took over in 1868, Stevens was unknown. But by May of 1870, he was the top Republican in Caswell County. As Reg mentioned, he had been elected the state senator. He had access to Governor Holden and other high-ranking officials in Raleigh. So Governor Holden is a very interesting figure. If you've never explored it, there's some biographies of him that are worthwhile. So Governor Holden, after Stevens won election to the state senate, he was prominent. He was the most prominent Republican. And by the way, in Caswell County is over 60% black. There's a majority of freed people. And they're virtually 100% of the black folk are Republicans. The Republicans want to support their right to vote, and the opposition does not. And there's a handful of white people who are also Republicans. Stevens the foremost. So Governor Holden appointed the Senator Stevens a justice. He appointed him a justice of the peace. So he now has authority to issue arrest warrants. And he also appointed him to be a colonel in the state militia for Caswell County. Stevens had no military experience whatsoever, but he got the appointment because he was loyal to the Republican Party and he was committed to equal voting rights. The people who had military experience were Confederates. And they had just fought a war to stop those things from happening. So Stevens, he accepted that appointment. But he was very, very inexperienced. So getting back to Sam Allen. Sam Allen reaches Stevens in Greensboro, and the two of them go to Stevens' house in Yanceyville. They probably walked. This is May 1870. The Ku Klux have been threatening John Stevens for the past 2 years. He knows they're after him. He has reinforced the walls of his house with thick boards to make it bulletproof. He's got a stock of arms and ammunition. And he's fixed his stairway so that he can let down, so he can pull up a trap door and people can't get up to the second floor. He's turned his house into a fortress. So they're safe there. And they sit down and they write a letter to Governor Holden telling what happened to Sam Allen. Tells Governor Holden that both of their lives are in danger. And Stevens asks Holden to send us arms and ammunition, so I can appoint Sam Allen to be the leader of a squad of militiamen from his community, so they can protect that school. Allen heads to Raleigh with that letter in hand. He meets personally with Governor Holden, and he pleads for military protection. And it's not just for himself, it's also for Stevens. He's pleading. Here is that letter. It's right there in the governor's papers. He says, Sam Allen will come to you. Samuel Allen has come to me with information which he will lay before you. It's not hard to find. And writing this letter was one of the last things John Stevens did before he was murdered. But I haven't seen any reference to it in any of the other accounts of Reconstruction days in Caswell County or about Stevens. No reference to Sam Allen or his school. But that's important. I don't think that you can talk about John Stevens unless you know what he was doing when he was killed. So Allen leaves for Raleigh. What does Stevens do that day? Well, he's a justice of the peace, and he's recently issued arrest warrants against 3 Klansmen. So these 3 Klansmen had, and about 10 or 15 others. I mean, these folks never went out except in force. They had beaten a young black school teacher named Joseph Womack. And the sheriff, so Stevens had issued these arrest warrants. The sheriff had them in custody, and they were due for a preliminary hearing before Justice of the Peace Stevens to set their bail. All the Yanceyville lawyers had volunteered to defend these guys, and there was an angry crowd gathering in the street because they would attend these hearings en masse, the Klan sympathizers. They would try to pack the juries. If they couldn't do that, they would just try to intimidate them. So the mood on the street was so ugly that the prosecutor gathered the defense attorneys together, and they all agreed, we can't let this hearing go forward. It's just going to be a riot. So the defendants agreed to waive their right to a hearing and just post bail and stand trial when the Superior Court next convened. And that story is as told by the prosecutor who was there in reminiscences that he published years later. And as far as I know, I'm the only one who's come across it. It was in the newspapers. So that's on a Monday in May of 1870. Saturday, 5 days later, Stevens goes back into that courthouse to hear a political speech. And it's by Bedford Brown that Reg mentioned. He's the one whose state Senate seat Stevens had taken over in 1868. He was famous back then. We've forgotten about him. But at the time, he was one of the most recognizable figures in North Carolina. He'd been a United States Senator for two terms. And he was one of the largest slave owners in Caswell County. He's the senator in the title of the book. So Brown is giving his speech in the crowded second floor courtroom in that beautiful courthouse. Stevens is listening, and sitting not far from him are a number of Klansmen, including this guy, John Green Lee. This is a formal portrait photo of John Green Lee taken in 1919 by the North Carolina Historical Commission. In 1919, the Klan was in very good standing with the white people of this country in North Carolina. That was when Jim Crow was in full swing. So Lee had come to Raleigh to give a confidential oral history of the Caswell County Ku Klux Klan. And I think he was probably treated as kind of a secret celebrity. But he spiffed himself up and got this portrait taken. And I think it pretty well captures how the lost cause historians would like us to think of Klansmen. You know, he looks like a decent fellow. This is how John Green Lee would have appeared to the people he was brutalizing back in 1870. This is an actual Ku Klux mask that was captured about that time, I think from Person County. They wore these masks to prevent identification, to scare people, and I think to get into the role. In a costume, they could do things they wouldn't do with their faces showing. And I think that's what was really terrifying about the masks. You see a bunch of people dressed up like that with weapons that show up at your door, you know they are completely unaccountable and they're going to do whatever they want. Now, during this period, there was a big propaganda war about whether the Ku Klux Klan even existed. When the leading Republican newspaper in Raleigh printed Sam Allen's account of how the Ku Klux Klan had attacked him, and then they come back a few days later, they actually killed the man on that second visit. The leading conservative newspaper said that the Republican newspaper had fabricated the incident, and the editor of that paper should know better than to print these distorted, false stories repeated to it by excited, superstitious, unreliable parties. That appeared regularly. And when they couldn't deny that the incident actually happened, they would print something to make it clear that, well, yeah, it shouldn't have happened, but they really asked for it. And you shouldn't be sorry that this, whatever, murder or outrage happened. So the significance of this picture was taken about a year after Stevens was killed. It was after a lot of stuff had happened, but they were still trying to prove to people, as you know, in the North, people didn't know what to believe. They heard these stories about people dressed up in costumes and hanging people and whipping them. They didn't know whether to believe it or not. A lot of times it was denied by Southern newspapers. So this guy on the far left, oops, in that costume there, this is a reenactment. That's Captain Joseph Hester, who's a Secret Service detective. He was sent down originally to investigate the Stevens murder and find out who did this. But almost immediately his mission was changed. He said, well, look, we're not going to worry about past crimes. Infiltrate the Klan, catch them in the act, and then we can prosecute them successfully. So he went to Moore County, had a squad of soldiers, and they caught all these Klansmen getting ready to hang a man, his name was Campbell. And they got their costumes, they brought them back to Raleigh, they paraded them down the street, and it was a big deal. And then they took the costumes, they dressed people up in them. These are some black men. You can tell by their hands that they're just wearing them for the purposes of this photograph. And then they got the photograph, and then they circulated. They had it engraved, and they had like broadsides printed up, and they had it circulated all over the country because they were still trying to convince people this was really happening. I mean, we've kind of accepted that it was really happening, but it took a long time to say. So getting back to John Green Lee, he was from a prosperous slave-owning family there in Caswell County. He served 3 years in the Confederate cavalry and then returned home to find his family fortune reduced by about 90% when the slaves were emancipated. So he'd basically been disinherited. He's called the Knight of the Bleeding Heart in the book because that's what he called himself when he competed in a ring tournament held in Yanceyville in 1865. Has anyone here, before, I know some of you have read the book, has anybody here ever heard of a ring tournament? Does anybody know what they are? Yeah, that's an interest. I thought that was one of the most interesting things that I learned. Well, right after the Civil War, there was a craze for these ring tournaments. Where they were basically, the young men, a lot of them former cavalry, would dress up as medieval knights. They'd get on their horse, they'd get a lance, and they would have a ring set up with a crossbeam. The ring would hang down, and they would gallop at the ring and try to catch it on their lance. So it was like a non-violent joust. And these things had a formula. They get into their costumes, and then the winner got to select a young lady to be to be crowned as the Queen of Love and Beauty. And they would have a big banquet that night. That was a formula that went through. There was like a dozen of these between Appomattox and like February of 1866 in North Carolina. There's about a dozen that I've been able to find. There are probably more. So that's just, I mean, you could write a treatise about, Southern self-conceptions, Southern identity, based on the affinity for these. They were trying to find something to identify with, something that they could be proud of, that represented what they thought they were about. I thought Lee's choice of the name was pretty interesting, so I looked into it. And I found that the Knight of the Bleeding Heart was a hero in one of Sir Walter Scott's romance novels about medieval Scotland. His name was George Bruce, and the Bleeding Heart was the coat of arms. I'm sorry. His name was George Douglas. The Bleeding Heart was the coat of arms of the Douglas clan. And what it represented was the Douglas ancestor who was supposed to have worn in a silver locket around his neck the mummified heart of Robert the Bruce, hero of Scottish independence. So, in Sir Walter Scott's book, George Douglas dies in his armor. Mary, Queen of Scots, is dripping her tears onto his face when he dies. And somehow John Greenlee gets hold of that story and he chooses that fallen hero as his alter ego. Make of it what you will, what you can. So that was 1865. By 1870, Lee has been charged with several assaults. He's had one of his tobacco barns burned up, probably in retaliation. And he's been night riding, dressed up not as a knight, but as a Ku Klux, as we have seen. That's what we know about John Greenlee. Everything else that we know about him is from his confession to the North Carolina Historical Commission. So getting back to that courtroom scene, what happened to bring this sad story to conclusion? The former sheriff of Caswell County was somebody that Stevens trusted somewhat, and Stevens wanted to make an alliance with him, to get somebody to work with, somebody from the other side to work with the Republicans and settle things down. Instead, the former sheriff, a man named Frank Wiley, he tricked Stevens into going into a vacant office in the first floor of the courthouse. And it was there that John Greenlee and about 10 other men strangled him, slashed his throat, and stabbed him hard. That's a rear view of the courthouse showing windows into the room where Stevens was murdered. And this is a rear view of the courthouse. I got this on a buff street view. In 1870, that would have been the biggest and grandest building for miles around, certainly in Caswell County. But it's actually not that big of a building when you go by it by modern standards. So this murder is happening in this room here, while Bedford Brown is up here, making a political speech. If you make a direct line between John Stevens having his throat cut and Bedford Brown talking to all these Democrats about the upcoming election, it'd be about 20 or 30 feet. So executing a defenseless captive is not that easy. We have mechanisms inside us to stop us from doing that. But they managed it. At least one, and I think probably two of the people who did this, they had been arrested on Stephen's arrest warrants for beating that school teacher, Joseph Womack, and they had had their bail set by John Stevens that Monday. And Saturday, they killed him. So historian Hamilton, he tells us that although Stephen's murder was horrible, the provocation was undoubtedly great. Because Stevens was a barn burner. That is a false accusation. But even today, it keeps popping up like a whack-a-mole. It's pretty obvious. Stevens was killed because he was trying to take down the Klan, using his fairly pathetic powers as an official of the Republican government. That's why he was killed. And what he was doing there, trying to get arms for a black community that was being terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan, trying to get bail set for some people who had been properly arrested and accused of whipping a young man. Those things have been forgotten. And I think they should be remembered. So why was he killed inside the courthouse? Well, the Klan couldn't get to him elsewhere. He was well armed. He carried with him a 10-shot revolver. This was an unusual weapon. But he evidently went to some pains to get hold of it. If you're out on a country road and you get accosted by a posse of these folks, you want to have as many shots as you can. So if they'd attacked him out in the open, they'd probably kill him, but he was going to take some casualties with him. And as I said, his house was a fortress. So when Stevens showed up at that political meeting in the courthouse, the Klansmen who were there, they seized the opportunity. And I think it was not very well planned. I think it was done on the fly. And there's some things that are suggested in the book. If you read, you'll see that they had some crazy ideas about how they were going to get away with it. But they didn't. Stevens' people knew that he was under threat. And when he didn't come out of the courthouse, they realized his body is still in the courthouse. The door to that room was still locked. So about 20 of Stevens' supporters, they would have been young black men, they surrounded the building all night to keep anybody from going in or out. And the next morning, when it was light, they could see his body. That's the story of the murder in a nutshell. And I focused on it today because that's really what the Remembrance Coalition does. It brings the people who were victimized by the Klan and reminds them these were human beings. They did stuff. They had lives, and they were killed because they were doing something that put them crosswise with the Ku Klux Klan. And what Sam Allen and John Stevens did was pretty clear. These other folks, like the Morrows that James mentioned, I don't know what they were doing. But even if they were doing nothing but minding their own business and acting free, that took courage. And they need to be honored for that courage, all of them. I guess you could call this micro-history, going into just a few individuals and trying to figure out what's that person's story. And I guess that my background in litigating cases, that's kind of what I'm prepared for. But I've tried tried to do some other things in the book. This story is maybe 40 or 50 pages of it. There's a lot of context and background that I think helps you understand and is also just interesting in its own way. But I wrote this book to please myself. I wanted to write a book that was fun, and there were things that just interested me that I wrote, and you may or may not find them relevant, but I thought, if I think this is fun to write, maybe somebody will think it's fun to me. But the story of John Stevens is the thread that I hope holds it together and makes it kind of hang together as a book. And I'm just about to wrap up, but I want to mention some of the questions that the rest of the book tries to deal with. When Governor Holden sent militia into Caswell County to try to confront the plan, it failed. Why did it fail? He tried to declare martial law, and that just blew up in his face. Why? They had federal troops in Alamance County. He had asked for federal troops to be in Yanceyville. They were supposed to be there when Stevens was killed. They weren't there. And when they did show up in Alamance, they didn't do very much. Why not? So I tried to balance these individual stories. And by the way, in terms of remembrance, I came across a number of figures about which we don't know very much, but were just the name in some cases. And even if that was all we knew about them, I included it in the book. So I tried to have a balance between those small stories and having a bit of wider, and it'd be for others to say whether that was successful. Reg, that's about all of the prepared.
Thank you, sir. Paul, I am a historian, and you are an attorney. I have never felt the need to practice law. And I'm not sure how well it would be received if I did try. It's striking that you and James, who's an attorney, the distinguished jurist Willis Richard, has written the definitive biography of David Swain. Is there something in the skill set or the mindset that you have developed through your study of law that you bring to this project that allows you to have a different perspective or analyses that people who have traditional history training might not have?
I think the main thing that I think I brought to this project was how I regard facts and evidence. And I don't know how historians are trained. I've read some histories of PhD historians, which suggested to me that their training was inadequate.
And I'm not taking any of this personally.
In legal cases, especially the serious ones, like in death penalty cases, you are required to write a statement of facts that presents the court with all of the facts, including those that you don't like. And then your adversary gets to write a statement of facts along the same lines. And you can be absolutely sure that if you distort the facts or you leave anything out, your adversary is going to call you on it. And so I think that adversarial testing, it puts you in the habit that you write something, say, am I imagining that? Well, you go back and you look at the original source. I don't think I cited any secondary sources without going back and looking at the primary sources that they cited. As a lawyer, that's just basic hygiene, and I think that, God, there's some awful history out there, just awful. No offense to your comments. No, Reg has written a book about the Methodists, the black, the African American Methodist reaction to emancipation, and Reg's book is great.
Thank you, Paul. That almost cleans it up. But
and in fairness, there have been, I've seen some pretty awful legal writing as well.
There was a reviewer found a particular strength in your analysis of the weaknesses of the legislation that empowered Holden to go after the claim. Could you mention just a little bit about that?
This is something called the Schaffner Act, that the Klan was getting very violent, and the authorities are really finding themselves at a loss how to deal with it. And they tried a couple of different legislative approaches that were just not effective at all. They established a detective bureau for the first time, a statewide law enforcement agency. First statewide law enforcement agency in North Carolina. A squad of maybe 15 or so detectives, and guess what? John Stevens was appointed one of them. That's how thinly spread was the talent in the Republican Party. And another one that made riding around with masks with the intent to terrorize a misdemeanor. They went nowhere. So when the Klan really started to get out of control, they were kind of desperate, and they created this thing called the Schaffner Act, which talked about declaring a county in a state of insurrection and dealing with it with a military response. And this was extremely controversial, and the public debate and the debate within the General Assembly, everybody kind of assumed that, oh, this authorizes the governor to declare martial law and send in the troops. Now, martial law is a really loaded term. I mean, that means you go out and try people with your officers being the judge and the jury and execute them right then and there, no appeal. Well, the Schaffner Act really didn't actually authorize martial law, and it couldn't have, because the constitutions of the North Carolina and the United States wouldn't have permitted it. But people thought that's what it was, and it just led to that confusion led to terrible results. Holden kind of knew that it didn't authorize it, but the public kind of thought that it did, and he ended up kind of halfway doing martial law and halfway not, and it was a disaster. So there were lawyers involved in this disaster. The historians have nothing to do with it.
But just, in effect, the legislation was not sufficient to empower Holden to do what he knew he had to do. Is that right?
That is right. And the federal government didn't have the authority either.
Just in defense of historians, I wanted to mention Lloyd Kramer there, who was another, like James Williams, a champion of public history and getting the word out to the public in as many ways as possible. Thank you for being here also, Lloyd. Paul, one of the times, I think we were at the Mad Hatter, and you were telling me about, you were in the process of writing the section on Pharaoh Glass. And when you told me that story, it wasn't just the information. It was the way you spoke about it, about the grip it had on you to discover this story and to tell this story, largely unknown, I believe, before your book. Could you just say a word or two about Pharaoh Glass and his life and death?
Yeah. This is really a sad thing. Pharaoh Glass was a blacksmith. He had been enslaved most of his life. But in 1867, he was a free man. And I don't know if he learned to read and write while he was a slave. That would have been illegal, but some folks managed to do it. Or if he just learned very quickly. But he was literate enough to become a voter registrar under the federal military occupation in 1967. He was part of a 3-person election board that registered voters in the northern half of Caswell County in late 1867. The head of that 3-person board was Albion Tourget, who is a very significant figure in Reconstruction. And by the way, I've got all the records of Tourget's service as an election registrar. There are 3 full biographies of Tourget, and not one of them mentions the fact that he got his start, his first public office was as an election registrar. These records are in the 2nd Military District records in the National Archives in Washington. And I don't think any of the Tourget biographers went to look for them. They wouldn't have known to look there. I was looking for stuff about Stevens. So Pharaoh Glass, he goes and he goes to 5 or 7, or 5 different locations in Caswell County, visits each of them twice for several days each time with this board of election registrars. And you've got freed slaves. You shouldn't call them slaves. Freed people who used to be enslaved coming in to register. And mixed along with them are ex-Confederate soldiers. I mean, they're all registering to vote at the same locations. They're all appearing before this panel of 2 white men and 1 black man. And so, was that a provocation by Pharaoh Glass that he had the nerve to go out and blatantly serve as a federal election registrar? So early December, he disappears. And his wife thinks maybe he went off to Greensboro. That's where he went to get sworn in. And a few days later, they find his jacket and his glasses laid neatly by a pond on the plantation of his former master, Iverson Glass. And they search the water and they find him at the bottom of the pond with a 25-pound rock tied to his neck. So the conservatives hear this, and they write these stories. That's what happens to folks when they serve under Albion Tourget. He was so despondent over his bad judgment that he killed himself in a fit of depression. So they said it was a suicide. And Governor Holden said, well, wait a minute. Governor Holden, by the way, he's the editor of the leading Republican newspaper, so he can get the word out about things that he wants the public to know. He publishes a brief story that says, well, maybe this guy was murdered, it should be investigated. But he's just a newspaper editor. The Army doesn't investigate, the Freedmen's Bureau doesn't investigate, the coroner of Caswell County doesn't investigate. So all we have is this story that, oh, he was very despondent, he must have killed himself. But I think what Reg is talking about, how the story affected me, and it will affect you too, if you just really put yourself in that scene and just imagine it, how it must have been, I don't think he killed himself. And how do you end up at the bottom of the pond with a 25-foot block over there? You saw that picture of those men in their costumes. I don't know if they had costumes on or not, but there was certainly a bunch of them, 10 or 15, enough to make resistance futile. So to get his jacket off him, get his glasses off him, maybe they were cajoling him at this point, I don't know. But Pharaoh Glass was a brave man. He registered voters, and we know in our own lifetimes that can be dangerous. It was real dangerous in 1870. But that's what I know about Pharaoh Glass.
Thank you.
He should be in your list, James.
I'm on it.
It's a powerful, moving story, and when I heard about it for the first time from Paul, as opposed to reading it, I was just, part of what was so powerful and offensive about it was how, the joke they made of his death. How, he probably committed suicide because he was voting for the wrong people and it went to his head and he just couldn't handle it. And I'm thinking about this man in his 60s who had some sense of self because he was a blacksmith, and some sense of his responsibility to his community, and knowing what the cost would be for serving as a register and making decisions and letting people vote and being on a panel where you're also questioning white men. He knew how inflammatory that was, and that this bespectacled man in his 60s who did not have to take that position thought, in one sense, that he did have to take it, and made that kind of sacrifice. You happen to run across him. I'm sure there are other stories, many stories like that, but we're relying on James and others to lift these stories up and to give these people the respect and recognition. It's also, every time there is an election and you're wondering whether it's worth voting, think about Pharaoh Glass and what that meant to him. I have time for one last question, and this is, then it will be your turn. You know more at this point about John W. Stevens than any living person. You probably have more perspectives on Stevens than he had on himself, because you've looked at him from ways that he could not see and have the benefit of hindsight in all those kinds of things. Suppose all that history has taken place and through some metaphysical miracle, Stevens came here. Is there anything that you would want, based on your knowledge of him and this story, that you would want to ask him that you couldn't find out or just of interest to you? Or is there anything that, based on your assessment of him and his life, is there anything that you would like to tell him?
First, I want to give a disclaimer. I think that I've collected more of whatever is out there about Stevens than anybody, and I think it's all referenced in the footnotes. But I don't think that we really know Stevens all that well, because as you know, there's much more that's never put down on paper. And the papers that survive are they can be contradictory and fragmentary sometimes. So I can't claim, and I don't think I claim in this book to have great knowledge and insight into John Stevens. I can say some things that I think are true about him. I think he was earnest and sincere. I think he was kind of hot-headed. He had time. I think he meant to do the right thing most of the time. And I think that he kind of cut a few corners here and there. He got in hot water one time in the General Assembly for trying to pay another senator to make an argument for him, which is, it's not entirely honest. I think he tried to, he made the best of it that he could. But, so I don't want to make global judgments about him, and I don't want to make global judgments about John Green Lee either. I hope I have refrained from doing so. I've told you what I found out about him. I mean, the fact that he was involved in this murder and then later gave a statement to the Historical Commission basically bragging about it, that's not a characterization of John Green Lee. Those are just facts. And I've reproduced his statement in the books.
Paul, I'm not asking you to make a judgment. Just what would you ask him?
Oh, what would I ask him?
Or what would you tell him at the end of this? I'm trying to be supportive of your book and how it is probably the definitive.
Yeah, I guess you asked such a hard question. I was trying to answer a different question. What would I ask him? God.
What would you ask him, or what would you tell him?
Well, I would show him my smartphone.
That wasn't the answer I was expecting.
I mean, I would love to have met him. I think that he was probably very accessible. I don't think he was the slightest bit pretentious. Ask him. I think I would just want to get him talking and see what he had to say. And if he read the book, I don't think I would have to ask him anything. I think I'd get careful. He would set me straight, I'm sure.
You are quite right that our perception of people that we don't know, that we learn only through sources. I mean, if somebody only knew us by our emails, they might understand who we are and they might have a very skewed idea of who we are, but having thought about this person in his life, I was just wondering if you had any questions for him. I think that brings this, it's now your time to ask questions or make comments, and Paul, I'll let you direct this part.
Thank you. And I don't assume that everybody has questions. I think you all might have things that you would like to say that are not questions, just to bring new information to the conversation.
It is a question, but it is a question, but hopefully brings new information. I would like to know, based on the research that you did in regards to some of the lynchings and the culprits being Klan members, I know a lot of times they knew their victims. They would know their victims outside of hearsay. They would actually have intimate knowledge, maybe be neighbors or former friends, et cetera, et cetera. Did you find any evidence of that in some of this? And with Mr. Lee's confession, was he direct in the associates that assisted him naming other culprits?
First, as to whether the Ku Klux who did these things knew their victims, I think very often they did, but not always. If they were going to do something really serious, the story is out there, and I haven't seen evidence of it, but the historians have said they would get the neighboring county to come over and take care of such and such a person, because that way they knew that the people from the other county would never be identified, and then they would return the favor. But there are plenty of incidents where they recognize people, even with their disguises on, they were often able to recognize them. And in the book, there's an incident just mentioned where John Lee and Captain Mitchell, who was one of the people who murdered Stevens, they had they basically terrorized this magistrate. They whipped him and terrorized him and the people who worked on his farm. They drove him out of Caswell County because Mitchell had accused a black man of stealing a hog from his farm, and the case went before this magistrate, Magistrate Jones, for trial, and Jones acquitted him. So Mitchell and Lee and a bunch of them had to beat the hell out of this magistrate. So they sometimes had very intimate knowledge of each other. And Joseph Womack, he recognized, I think, 5 or 6 of the people who whipped him. At first he wouldn't say who they were. And it wasn't until he and Stevens managed to get a commitment from Raleigh that, no, we're going to get some federal troops out there, that they felt secure enough to say what they knew. So yeah, do you know about incidents, particular incidents where that was?
I know the Morrow case, I think they recognized, the white recognized. The Morrow case, which we were discussing earlier, and I've actually been to talk on it, I think the wife, the mother recognized the face of some of the people that were attacked. So that's what I know it happens, and I know they usually know at points where they're dealing.
Yeah, I think there's a question that somebody.
Thank you for all your research. Given the current attempt to remove 60,000 votes for the state Supreme Court due to so-called registration areas, I was just curious, with the electoral committee that would register voters back at that time, I presume the federal government had already forgiven all the Confederate soldiers, so there wasn't any issue anymore about voting. And I guess what criteria, what were they being evaluated for to see if they could vote?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last bit?
I'm sorry, I should have taken my mask off. What did the electoral commission, what were they looking for to see if people did qualify to vote? They'd already gotten parole from the federal government, I believe, the Confederate ones.
The Congress had prescribed a very detailed oath that every voter had to take when they were registered. And it's basically 2 parts of it. It was okay if you'd been a Confederate soldier, but if you had held office, an office where you swore allegiance to the United States Constitution, and then volunteered, not drafted, but then volunteered, or offered support to the Confederacy, sent slaves to work on fortifications, for example. If you had been an office holder, and then after taking that oath you did any of those things, you couldn't vote in 1868. And so these registration boards, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the reasons that they were presented. Everybody who went in there had to recite this long oath, and it was a real bore. And they had to sign it at the bottom. And some of the people weren't qualified. They were turned away. As far as I can tell, about 3% of the people who tried to, 3% of the white people who tried to register were not allowed in Caswell County, and many others probably never tried. Does that respond to your question?
What about the former enslaved? Do they have anything special besides that oath?
No, but there was a provision that affected them more than the it affected the wives, and that was the felony. If you had been convicted of a felony, you couldn't register in 1868. And prior to 1868, you could be convicted of a felony pretty easily if you were a former slave. Things that, in fact, there was a dispute about whether certain petty crimes were felonies or misdemeanors, and that was one of the issues about having former enslaved registered. Reg, have I missed something else?
Thank you. I'm curious how it was that Stevens had such strong moral character.
That's a really good question. I guess it's not true that I really didn't try to evaluate Stevens, because I think I said something about that. That was, a lot of inference. I think that there were some class issues going on. He did not have property. He was not very well educated. He was a Methodist. The top dogs were Presbyterians. And he was unknown, and I think he was kind of used to being treated like, his second class compared to the plantation owners. I mean, his plantation owners, they were masculine. They were the tech bros of their day. They were the master class. And there were some incidents in which Stevens basically blew up. I mean, this incident with the chickens, it was a dispute between neighbors. And Stevens really lost his cool at one point, and it resulted in a serious fight that landed him in jail. And then there's another, he got charged with an affray on another occasion. I think he just, in his gut, he really didn't like being pushed around. And if he was, he would fight back. And I think that's one of the things that he could identify with, maybe more than a lot of other white folks, when he saw black folks being treated that way.
Do I recall he ate the chickens?
He did eat the chickens. I don't think it was the eating part that
I just add to that as we're going to the next question. As those of you who've read the book know that there is nothing prior to his, your question was actually it was something we had talked about before. And there was nothing, as you read the book, prior to him becoming involved in politics that would give any indication that this guy is going to wind up where he does. He's getting in fights over chickens, not over principles or issues or racial equality or any of those things. So it's striking. I suppose I got a chance to ask him a question. I tried to probe him to get at just what you were trying to get at. And also an interesting sidelight is his political career begins when he is recruited to replace Pharaoh Glass as a registrar.
Yeah, that's another thing. That was Stevens' first foray into politics, was taking Pharaoh Glass's place. This is a month after this guy had been found at the bottom of a mill pond. Stevens is, 3 months. I think Stevens had to have known what happened, and he had to have at least had a strong suspicion that Pharaoh Glass was a victim. And when he stood for Senate, one of the first things he did was he filed complaints with the military authorities asking that some of these Democrats be arrested for acting improperly at a Republican campaign. I mean, he was very combative. law.
Thank you. I'm going to speak as a historian. But I love lawyers. I have a brother. But I want to turn the question around. Reg says, what would you want to ask John Stevens? I want to pretend that I'm John Stevens and Farrell Glass, and I just walked into your century, right now, your year, 1 week before the new regime takes power in our country. So my question is, we have thought from our study of history that law provides protections, guardrails for rights, for human rights, for voting rights, and that strong-willed people can stand up and defend those principles. And yet, my story suggests that both of those dreams, aspirations, views of the law and strong-willed people are wrong. What do you think? I'm asking you now. The dialogue is getting turned upside down.
Yeah.
Is it, in fact, a story that shows the law cannot protect rights as we once imagined, and that strong-willed people who try to defend those rights are putting themselves at enormous risk, even now, in our own time?
That's a great question. And obviously I don't have the answer to it, if there is one. I think that there have been times when people could stand up using the law. And in fact, I couldn't have had the career that I've had if that wasn't true. I mean, I've done several class actions trying to, for the conditions and the rights of people in jails and prisons, or the procedures that have been followed in courts. And I've been able to do that, and the law supported me. I've been able to go to the high appellate court on behalf of people who appear to have done some of the worst crimes that can be committed, and gotten those courts to listen to me, and in some cases, grant relief to those people. So it can work. There have been times when it couldn't work, and there have been times when for certain people it couldn't work, and for others it could. And 1868, 1870 was a transition time. Before the Civil War, it was considered normal for nearly half of the population to be treated like non-citizens, to be considered, to be counted up for purposes of tax assessment, never for purposes of voting registration. The change that happened between the end of slavery and 1868, I don't accept what some people say is, oh, it was all inevitable. The actions of individual people, I think, did make a difference. And as a historian, I'd like to hear what you think about that period. Was it all inevitable that we're going to have the Civil War, and that the white population just was not going to accept the fact that black, and I should say black men, it was another 50 years before women of any racial background could vote, but that they're actually going to have violence. Well, we just had a war over it. Yeah, there was going to be violence. So I think if there was a mistake made, it was thinking that the war was over in 1865. It wasn't over. You had driven the highly organized armies from the battlefield. That's what had been accomplished by 1865. But they sent them home with their guns. That's what they did after World War I in Germany. They sent these folks home, and they carried their arms home with them. And then they got home, and they started hearing the really poisonous propaganda about the Jews and sold them out. The same thing happened in the American South. They'd been defeated in war. Why were they defeated? Oh, God, it must be all these former slaves, and now look, they're coming on the boat. It was poisonous mix. And Torche, he seems to have thought that the North should have gone in and put what he called the iron heel down on the South. Really. And the North, it didn't do that. So, we're in a different situation now, but what do you think? Do you think that individual people could have possibly changed the course back in Reconstruction?
You can defer, you can defer if you like.
Red, I think Red is the one.
He used to be my chair.
So we only have, and certainly you can respond to that. I do have a question that I want to slide into.
We're running out of time.
And that is, if memory serves me correctly, a few months before John Stevens' White Outlaw was lynched in Alamance County. And this is for both of you. I mean, the difference in how they both were carried out, but also in terms of the response, at various levels. Could you speak briefly to that? Because it seemed to me, well, I'll let you speak to that.
I'd like to hear how it seems to you, James.
Well, I mean, I know that there was some significant response after the killing of John Stevens. I'm sure there was also some response with Wyatt, but it seemed that they were equally horrible.
Yeah.
One even much more public than the other. I mean, I guess that's why that was a racial terror lynching. But how did the governor respond differently to those two, I guess, is one question.
I think White Outlaw was a black man who lived in Alamance County.
Right.
He was like Sam Allen. He was a Union League leader. He had, after 1868, he was elected to office. He started a school in Alamance County. He was successful in what I think you would call a middle-class occupation for that period. And what the Ku Klux did in March of 1870, and it was a horrible crime. I mean, Stevens was bloodier, but this was horrible. They took him and hung him from a tree right in front of the Alamance County Courthouse.
They dragged him out of his home in front of his mother and kids, okay, and then hung him right in front of her. Now, his mom is fighting, trying to beat them off. So it is worse. I mean, Stephen may have been more bloody, but the deed, I think, was worse. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you start comparing these crimes and saying, well, which is worse? And at some point, you just throw up your hands. I mean,
No, but I was responding to how you responded, I guess. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I think that Holden responded vigorously to the hanging of White Outlaw. He immediately asked for federal troops. They went in, they occupied Graham, they occupied company shops, which is now Burlington. And those soldiers were ready to go out on the road and stop people at night and shoot them if they tried to evade arrest. But they couldn't because their superiors in the Army chain of command, and remember, Andrew Johnson is the person who's at the top of the chain of command, and he tried to veto all of the Reconstruction Acts. So he is not going to authorize the use of force against these terrorists. But Holden got those folks in place, and they sat there for something like 6 weeks in Alamance County, and nobody was arrested, but their presence managed to stop further things from happening. When Stevens' murder happened, now Wyatt Outlaw is black, Stevens is white, and I think it's a fair suspicion that, okay, a black man can get murdered and we're not going to call out the militia, but a white man, happens to a white man, we're going to call out the militia. I don't think that was actually a big factor. I mean, race then was a factor in everything, I think. But Holden was already in a really weakened position. There was the troops in Alamance who had just been starting to be removed and transferred elsewhere when the people in Caswell started saying, well, wait a minute, the Klan is really acting up here. We need some troops here. And he did ask for some troops to be sent to Caswell. After Stevens was murdered, they finally, a number of weeks after that murder, Holden finally got a state militia together. It took a long time to get them organized. They had to assemble equipment, which they got from Washington. They talked about what they had to do, and they always talked about Wyatt Outlaw and John Stevens together. They talked about Alamance and Caswell as being part of the same problem. So I think the more significant than the difference, for one thing, Stevens was a statewide governmental official, right? And there had been a couple of those murders, but Wyatt Outlaw was a local guy. I think the most significant thing was just the sequence. The Schaffner Act is passed in December. The Ku Klux Klan murders Wyatt Outlaw, I think, in February. It's like within a month of this thing coming into force, and it's like a big middle finger to the Holden administration. And then as soon as the federal soldiers start leaving, you have this second murder. I mean, it's like a double middle finger.
Right. We're about out of time. Can I make just one comment, and then we'll have it turn it over to you to close out? What you just heard was a debate between two attorneys. And there was some passion in this discussion, because beneath all the facts which are real, what we're coming away with, what we're feeling is that the murder of Wyatt Outlaw, even though his name is mentioned with Stevens, somehow doesn't have the historical significance of the murder of John Stevens. That the Kurt Holden War begins after the murder of Stevens, not after the murder of Outlaw. Even though both names and all the things that you said make sense. And part of why the work of the coalition is so important is to, again, not to make invidious comparisons, but to make sure that every life is given sort of the recognition and worth in every sacrifice, and that some of these things are not intentional. It's about where the sources are and what people are willing to publish. And finding the sources, one of the things I meant to ask you about was the challenges that you found in finding information about Glass and Allen and Wilson Carey, black figures, who you gave a full effort to give light to in the book, but it took an extra effort. So part of what James is doing is just trying to level the moral playing field about what lives we should value, regardless of the difficulties that Holden faced. And the question before that Lloyd answered, I have a superficial response to an incredibly important question that came to all of us. Is the lesson of these deaths that, maybe at some point, as Turgis said, this was a fool's errand. This is a lightweight answer. The best I've got is that when people are involved in this kind of work, for these kinds of issues, one of the burdens they are dealing with constantly is discouragement and hopelessness. That you don't get into this kind of work if you don't have a high tolerance for dealing with that. And one of the quotes from Freedom Park, that's my favorite quote from the park, is by John H. Wheeler, who was a banker in Durham, head of Mechanics and Farmers Bank during the 60s. And you think as a black man who's the president of a bank, he's kind of have it made. And he would be saying that whether we're talking about the 1860s or the 1960s or 2024, is the phrase that's in Freedom Park over his name is, we have to understand that the battle for freedom begins every morning.
Em, thank you so much. That is a great way to end it. And Wheeler was a banker, but I think he also was a lawyer. So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Some-
James, and,
Yeah.
and thank you, Reg. This is, I don't think I'd have the courage to get out here if I didn't have Reg
Right.
there.
Yeah.
Back up.
Well, let's give both of them a round. And then I also want to mention that Paul's excellent book, he's got some copies for sale. You can purchase for $20 this evening, which is less than what you will be able to get them for anywhere else. And an additional inducement is $10 of that, if you purchase it this evening, will go to Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition. So please consider a purchase this evening.
Can it be bought directly from the Human Kindness Foundation?
I don't-
I'm familiar with the Human Kindness.
I don't know if it's available at the Human
It's
Kindness
not available to
Foundation.
Human Kindness.
Yeah. Okay,
Some of the money goes to them, it provides people in prison.
yeah. Well, anyway, thank you much to both of you, and thank you all for attending.